Welcome, and thank you for joining me for stories from Poplar Creek. Maybe you're winding down listening as you drift off to sleep, or maybe you're starting your morning. These tales are here to keep you company. I invite you to relax and enjoy wherever life finds you. Today, I'll introduce you to James, who's lived in Poplar Creek his whole life. Hit like or subscribe for the next chapter of Poplar Creek Stories. I'll see you on the other side. James Alder's heart lay as dormant as the field he stood in. Perhaps it was his 19 young years that imbued him with an intrinsic sense of how the seasons moved from fallow to fullness. He stood at the edge of a new field, imagining the house that would anchor him here to Poplar Creek. It was early, and the ground, still heavy with spring melt, grew cold through the soles of his boots and numbed his toes. Across the way, passenger pigeons were in flight against the fenceless sky. James exhaled, his breath marking the spot. On the far edge of the property, the creek frothed, swollen by rain and the last surrender of mountain snow. Beyond that, the land sloped into a rim of poplar, willow, and gray-green cottonwood, half twisted, their buds fat with the promise of another year. He ran his eyes hopefully over the rocky hummocks. They held a certain rugged charm, their surfaces glistening with dew that caught the light like scattered diamonds. Tender sprouts pushed through the earth, signaling nature's promise of renewal. Seemed to James that the morning was holding its breath for him, a canvas waiting for the strokes of time and care to bring forth a flourishing homestead. 160 acres. That was what the surveyor's plat said, though it looked like less, or more, depending on whether a man stood in hope or in defeat. He wasn't exactly certain which man he was yet. He'd signed for it with a determined hand at Parker's desk. Alder land, though his brothers had scattered west, and he alone stood to work it. James walked the length of the future home, counting paces with deliberate slowness. His mind's eye saw the bones of the house, a solid rectangle, 30 feet by 40, framed in beams as thick as his wrist, the roof timbered with pine and shake, and the sides clapboarded and whitewashed. He saw a wide kitchen, lit with the sun's first orange, a parlor with chairs, wild flowers set in jars, and the smell of cut wood. He'd have 2 rooms, with a staircase that led to comfort and rest. He hammered a stake into the black mud, using his heel to tamp it flush. The ache in his hand reminded him of last season's break, but he ignored it. He would mark these lines. James pressed on, moving to the south, sinking another stake with his mallet. He kept at it, sweat rising despite the cold. In a month the ground would be soft enough to dig trenches. In 2, he'd frame the floor. By autumn, he would live in these walls, or not at all. Memories unraveled as he bent to tie off the hemp twine marking the eastern wall. His thick brown hair tumbled across his eyes, but he saw his sister Rose, aged 12, her shadow longer than her body as she stooped to pull thistle from the old garden on the other side of Poplar Creek. Her laughter, raspy and bright, had filled the yard and added color to the house. James and his brothers had raised her best they could after the death of their parents. Rose had left her scarf on the fence post, and James, himself just 14 then, had pretended not to notice, just to watch her rush back, red-faced and shivering in the wind. He blinked, letting the picture collapse. There would be no scarf, no Rose, but James promised himself that he would hold on to her laugh. James was by Rose's side the day the fever took her. The air, stifling and still, smelled of vinegar, mustard, and hot, wet linen. The doctor's hands, raw from lying scald, soothed the girl's forehead while the boys watched, silent and hopeless. She died in the hour before sunrise, with a sound like a lamp wick drowned in oil. The silence was unbearable. His older brothers, Frederick and Edwin, dug Rose a grave next to Ma and Pa's. James carried her gently and laid her in, wrapping her scarf around her. "This will keep you warm, Rose," James spoke softly. The days and their hearts grew thin. James took to sitting on the porch steps, counting the sunrises, bracing himself against the cold. Now, with nothing but empty land in every direction, James felt the loss as a hunger. Not grief exactly, something leaner, bitter, and clarifying. He bent to the work, slicing at the root-thick soil with his spade, tearing up the brush that would choke the foundation if left unchecked. He worked until his hands bled, the blisters breaking off onto the haft of the tool. When the pain grew sharp enough to slow him, he stopped and lifted his eyes to the horizon. In the east, the light pooled blue and the willows cast long shadows over the water. He could hear far off the lowing of someone's herd. By mid-morning, he'd cleared a wide band along the creek, the brush stacked in pyres for burning. He then returned to the foundation lines, pacing them again, retracing the rectangle with measured steps. He drove in the final stake, wiped his brow, and permitted himself a moment's rest. A tree provided respite. James climbed it and took out some dried jerky and a book. He thought of his brothers. They had seen to it that James stayed in school. James was a bright boy, the brightest in his class, and they made sure he stuck to his studies as Ma and Pa would have done. But 5 years after Rose's death, Frederick and Edwin craved a new horizon. They sold the family home, divided the money, and headed to Oregon. The day of their departure was a stake marking a line in James's life. They stood together, and Fred's bare arms enveloped him in a hug. Edwin joined, and they stood there solid against the world, eyes wet. "You sure you won't change your mind, James?" Edwin asked hopefully. They understood why James couldn't leave. He wanted to stay in Poplar Creek near Ma, Pa, Rose, and Abigail. James loved the sounds, colors, and the people who saw them through the bad times. "You take care of yourself and use that head of yours. If there's trouble, you see Ingram here." Fred then pressed a pouch in James's hand. "A little extra to keep you going." The road held James's feet as he watched them disappear from sight. Fred and Edwin would write from the trail, hopes scrawled on the page as they told him of green valleys and wild rivers. James stared at the sky. The clouds were thin and the wind had shifted to the south. He sighed. Rain by nightfall. He'd need to level out some ground before it turned to soup again. By noon, sweat darkened the collar of his shirt, and his hands stung with every movement. He paused, looked back at what he'd begun, and lingered on a small sense of pride. He could see it now, a house. No, a home, a place where he and Abigail could raise children, and he could die in his own bed. He wondered if he should have those thoughts, but the idea seemed practical, and he allowed it. Tonight he would clean up, and tomorrow he'd ride in for supplies and speak to Abigail. He packed his tools and trudged up the path to the lean-to where he slept. He would return at dawn and every day after, until the house was built or he broke. He fell asleep to thoughts of Abigail's dancing curls and bright blue eyes. The bell above Goodwin's Mercantile cheerfully announced James' entry. The shelves were neatly stacked with various goods from canned beans to rolls of fabric. Sacks of brown sugar supported one wall, and a pot-bellied stove radiated warmth, casting flickering light on the satiny, smooth wooden floors. The counter was lined with jars of colorful candies, and the giant ledger sat patiently waiting for transactions. James took off his hat and shook out the damp from his hair. Ambrose Goodwin, bent behind the counter, looked up surprised at the early bell. Ambrose was a round man, in the way of a well-fed, contented domestic animal, but there was a keen, knowing intelligence. He nodded at James, who nodded back, and for a moment nothing needed to be said. "Morning, James," said Ambrose, already sliding a stub of pencil behind his ear. "Bit early for town, isn't it?" James set his list on the worn countertop, noticing little baby Sarah sat on a blanket behind the counter. Sarah had come in with last spring's supply of seed. She clutched a stub of chalk in her tiny hand, scribbling her future on a slate. A good one, through and through. "Well, not if you need seed before the frost's gone," James replied. "And nails, 2 pounds if you have 'em, and a ½ pound of salt and lamp oil." Ambrose scribbled notes and nodded. Sarah toddled toward her father's knee. He picked her up, kissed her quickly, and handed her off to James. "Hold this a minute, James, will you?" It was funny how Ambrose had watched the Alders grow up, and now James would see Sarah find her place amongst the tribe of Poplar Creek. Ambrose vanished into the back room, and James was left alone with the neat rows of goods and the placards handwritten in a careful script. Sarah flashed a dimpled smile. James smiled back and watched the dust motes float in the angled light. Then he moved to the window and checked the street. The morning was slow, only 2 wagons hitched up and no one on the boardwalk. "You still living out in the lean-to?" Ambrose ventured as he emerged from the stockroom. James grinned, but shivered. Ambrose nodded approvingly. "You're doing right by that land, son. Your father would have said the same." James let the compliment settle and warm his bones. "Thank you, sir. I hope so," he said. Neither spoke as Ambrose folded brown paper around the nails with the same care a mother might swaddle an infant. He measured the salt into a cone, twisted the paper closed, and snipped the twine with a single practiced motion that made a satisfying snap. "Joseph will see your supplies to the wagon," Ambrose called over his shoulder. "Joseph!" From the storeroom emerged the heir apparent, a young man tall and slender, and with none of his father's warmth. He wore the same pinched expression he had worn in school. He believed himself destined for grander things than hauling supplies for farmers. The bell chimed again. This time James's heart picked up. Abigail Parker breezed in on a drift of cool air, her cheeks rosy and her dark hair pulled back into a cluster of curls. As the banker's daughter, Abigail wore the city on her sleeve, even in this remote outpost. Her gloves were kid leather, her coat a blue finer than anything made in Poplar Creek. She met James's gaze, and her face lit in a smile. "Well, you've been busy, James Alder," she teased, nodding to the baby. James quickly handed baby Sarah over the counter to her father. "Good morning, Mr. Goodwin," Abigail said, her voice clipped but polite. "I'm to fetch a parcel for father from the rail office." "Oh, yes, Miss Parker. Came in last night. Heavy as sin, but I'll bring it out." He disappeared again. Abigail turned to Joseph. "We'll see you tonight, Mr. Goodwin?" Joseph smiled through his spectacles. "Yes, Miss Abigail. I look forward to it." Joseph headed to the door with James's goods. James moved to Abigail's side and felt the lightest shift of her weight as she moved closer to him. "Don't look at me like that, James Alder. Mother and Father are having the Goodwins around for supper. A tiresome, stuffy affair, I assure you," she smiled pertly. "I hear you bought land west of town," she continued, tilting her head to one side. "I did," James answered as he pulled gently at the ribbon on her dress. "They say you're building yourself a house." "They say right." She hesitated, picking at her glove. "It's good land," she said at last. "But, James, do you ever wonder if you were built for something more?" "I was hoping you'd ride out with me this afternoon to take a look," said James, meeting her eyes. Ambrose returned with the parcel wrapped in burlap and twine. "Here we are," he said, setting it on the counter. He did not look at either of them directly, but James caught the flicker of his eyes. Abigail reached for the package and nearly lost it on the smooth counter. James caught the edge, steadying it with a hand. He took the package from Abigail and nodded toward the door. "Thank you, Mr. Alder." "Good day, Mr. Goodwin," sang Abigail with the bell as it rang their departure. James followed Abigail into the bright, cold morning. From the first day of school when they were 7 years old, James had watched Abigail Parker's curls bounce as she skipped ahead of him on the path to school. She was bold where he was measured, and she was possessed by energy and direction. Abigail now led James across the street toward the bank, then paused near an alcove, out of sight from prying eyes. James set the package down and pulled Abigail urgently toward him. He kissed her deeply, and she responded to his desire. But when he paused to search her eyes, she pulled away and turned to go. "So, will you come out with me today, Abigail, to see the land?" James pressed. "Well now, James, you know I ache to see it, but Mother has me promised to some luncheon with some old stuffy people from out east." Later, as James turned homeward, a strange imbalance settled in his chest. But the sky, blue as promise, steadied him. The soil was rich with spring. He paused briefly as he came to the turnoff to his old family home, his eyes remembering ghosts. He squared his shoulders and continued straight on. This was his road now, the one that would carry him forward. The day the Turners arrived, Poplar Creek marked its importance with a pause. James Alder watched the gathering townfolk inch closer to the rutted main road, faces tipped into the wind as if scenting rain. The sky was gray, and the wind bit through shirts and sashes, pinching cheeks and noses. Even Reverend Caldwell's children, usually immune to weather and decorum, crowded the walk in silent expectation. The stagecoach appeared first as a flickering speck, then jangled into focus, the horses looking beleaguered and ready for the fresh feed and bedding that awaited them at the livery behind the smithy. The coach slowed with protest, brakes shrilling as it swung into the single loop of town. The driver, a tall man in a battered black coat, stepped down from the coach, boots sinking an inch into the mud. He had the look of a tree struck by lightning, splendid once, still upright, but marked. The shotgun driver seemed frozen in place after the long drive. "Oh, isn't it exciting?" bubbled Abigail, stealing up behind James before heading to the dressmaker's. "Poplar Creek is getting a doctor and a teacher. Aren't we clever? Mother and Father are having them to supper tonight." The coach door opened and travelers began to unfold themselves into the morning light. James saw immediately what mattered to the folks in town. The man, straight-shouldered, fair-haired, with the doctor's bag clutched in one hand and a cane in the other. The limp was not pronounced, but each step seemed to require negotiation. That would be Dr. Isaac Turner. He turned to help a young woman, her slender form held in perfect, unyielding balance. That would be Miss Helen Turner, schoolteacher. From under her bonnet spilled hair the color of prairie wheat in late summer. She gathered her skirts in a careful fist and landed softly on the ground. The crowd stood in awkward silence. It was Helen Turner who broke the silence at last. "Thank you, Mr. Whitlock," she called to the driver, voice warm and clear. Oh, much obliged, Miss Turner. The driver nodded, a smile cracking his face bricked with dust. Helen's gaze swept the crowd. She inclined her head, and her face broke the morning chill with a glorious smile. James listened to the whisper chain shiver through the crowd. Patched up soldiers at Antietam, I heard. What of her, the sister? Unmarried and fair as morning. Won't last long in these parts. Ambrose Goodwin stepped out onto the porch of the Mercantile, smoothing his hair, and his wife Evelyn smiled beside him in a new dress. Welcome to Poplar Creek, he called, all professional cheer. You must be Doctor and Miss Turner. The doctor's smile was gracious, but tired. The very same, sir, he replied. Ambrose came forward, hand outstretched. Ambrose Goodwin, Goodwin's Mercantile. My wife's got coffee on, if you're inclined. The doctor nodded. Thank you, Mr. Goodwin. That would be most welcome. Helen extended her hand to Mr. and Mrs. Goodwin, her eyes never wavering as she greeted them. You go ahead, Isaac, Helen directed her brother. I'll be just a moment. I need to settle our things. That done, the crowd started to go about its business, the consensus being one of personal pride and accomplishment. Helen's eyes tracked the town, taking it in with some secret pleasure. She missed nothing, James noted. He lingered at the edge, watching Helen orchestrate the trunks into an orderly pile, cheerfully declining the offers of help from half a dozen men. She worked with precision, brisk but not hurried. Her every motion said she knew her purpose. Finally, when she thought she was alone, she stood up straight and put her face to the sun, which seemed to emerge at her beckoning. She removed her bonnet and closed her eyes. Then she suddenly turned, her startling brown eyes meeting James's across the wavering shimmer of air. She didn't flinch, but acknowledged him, just for a second, with a nod meant only for him. James met her gaze. He touched his hat, stepped off the porch, and headed toward the smithy. From the corner of his eye, he saw Helen return her bonnet to her head and cross through the muddy street toward the Mercantile and the promised respite of coffee and refreshment. Her dress, already ringed with silt from the journey, took nothing away from her. There was no vanity to her, but neither did she shrink from the eyes of Poplar Creek. She moved as though the world had always been this way, men watching, judging, calculating, and she letting none of it touch her. James felt the weight of the morning like a finger pressed to his breastbone. The home began to take shape as steadily as the hands that were tasked to it. After laying the foundation, James took to the business of felling trees, the rhythmic swing of his axe marking time like a heartbeat. Each night he collapsed into bed, muscles groaning, mindful of joists and beams. He imagined someday opening that front door, welcoming someone inside to a home that could withstand winters and hold laughter. With a wagon load of timber ready, James set out for town. He tucked a biscuit and his dog-eared copy of Emerson into his coat pockets before heading down the road filagreed with frost and mud. Miss Turner's school bell echoed through town as he delivered his load to the mill. A strange wind picked up as James made his way to Goodwin's Mercantile, and with it came strange news. Evelyn Goodwin's face flushed crimson when she spotted James at the counter. "Ambrose!" she called, voice pitched higher than usual. "The baby needs me. You'll help James." She vanished in a flutter of calico. Ambrose emerged, clearing his throat. "James." "Sir?" "Well now, we've had some news," started Ambrose, trying to summon some cheer. "It seems that Mr. Parker has offered Joseph a position in his Chicago bank." "Well, that's fine news, sir. Joseph is certainly capable and determined. You must be very proud." "Yes, well," Ambrose shifted his weight. "There's more. You see, the boy's getting married." James mentally catalogued the eligible young women in town. They all knew Joseph. Must be some Eastern gal. Son, I hate to be the one. The bell above the door jangled, nearly knocking Ambrose over. Abigail burst in, cheeks flushed, eyes bright with excitement. "Oh, God, Abigail, no!" James said aloud.